Welcome, wanderers of the dark, to echoes from the campfire, where whispered tales twist into nightmares, and every flicker of firelight hides a story waiting to consume you. Here, legends are reborn, fears take shape, and the echoes of the past refuse to stay buried. Gather close, but beware. Some stories don't just end, they linger. Are you ready to listen? Tonight, the Apocryphal Collective presents The Sleepless Dead.
The first thing anyone noticed about Daniel Cade were his eyes. Not the color, an indistinct gray-green that tended to reflect whatever hue surrounded him, nor the shape, which was so ordinary it resisted memory, but the shadows. Beneath his eyes were deep, bruised crescents, as if something had reached out of the dark and pressed its fingers into his face, leaving marks that would never quite fade. The longer you looked, the more they unsettled you. People often described the feeling of staring into Daniel's gaze as akin to peering into a pond and realizing something beneath the surface was looking back. Daniel hadn't slept in years. There had been no defining moment, no sudden trauma or tragedy that flung him across the boundary that separates sleep from waking. One night he went to bed, closed his eyes as he always had, and the next morning realized he had never fallen asleep. That night, the same, and the night after. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Specialists examined him, their fingers cool and clinical, eyes gleaming with the promise of discovery. Therapists searched his past for an answer, convinced that some emotional rupture had caused his mind to barricade itself from rest. For a brief time, he was a novelty. Cable news segments and magazine articles asked, with polite sensationalism, whether Daniel Cade was a miracle or a medical mystery. Eventually, the novelty faded. The world moved on. Daniel remained. He lived, if you could call it that. He functioned. His body, despite every expectation, held together. He ate, walked, even worked in brief contract jobs that didn't ask too many questions. He smiled when it was appropriate, but the smiles never reached his eyes because Daniel Cade had not truly felt anything, joy, anger, grief, or love, for a very long time. The world existed at a distance, like watching a film play silently through thick glass. When asked how he endured, he offered the same tired refrain. You get used to it. But Daniel had never gotten used to it. Not really. He had simply become practiced in performing the rituals of the human condition. Rituals that had once been gates to rest and dreams. Now empty acts echoing the shape of a normal life. Each night he made tea, brushed his teeth, laid down in bed, and turned out the lights. He pulled the covers up to his chin and stared at the ceiling until morning bled through the blinds. Every night was an imitation of sleep. Every morning a performance of waking. Time behaved differently when one never slept. It elongated, thickened, lost its edges. Nights stretched into one another until they formed a kind of eternal dusk. In those hours, Daniel often sat in silence, not because he wanted to, but because silence became its own form of company. He filled the space with sound, classical music, the murmur of late-night television, podcasts he no longer heard. But even these were only distractions from the truth. The darkness had weight. It pressed against his bones and slipped between the seams of the world. Something lived in that stillness. Something he could not name. Then, 2 weeks ago, the visits began. It started with his mother. Daniel had been seated on the worn corduroy couch in his living room, the flickering light of a television painting static shadows on the walls. When he saw her standing in the hallway, she wasn't spectral, not in the way he had expected ghosts to be. She looked almost solid, almost warm, dressed in the same pale blue cardigan she had worn during her last weeks. Her hair was pinned back, and her mouth trembled with the attempt at a smile. He froze. His throat tightened. "Mom?" he whispered, the word foreign on his tongue. She took a small step forward. "Danny, it's been so long." He stood, knees weak. "You're dead." "I need your help," she said softly, as if she hadn't heard him. "There's a box in the attic. I left it behind. It matters." Daniel stared at her, the fear in his chest momentarily overtaken by confusion. "This can't be real." She stepped closer. The air grew colder. "You're awake, Danny. You're always awake. That's why I can come." And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. In the brittle light of morning, Daniel climbed into the attic. He half expected to find it empty, to prove to himself that the visitation had been the product of fraying nerves and a sleep-starved mind. But the box was there, hidden beneath a quilt and thick with dust. Inside were old letters, a stack of photographs he didn't remember ever seeing, and a small silver locket engraved with a date he didn't recognize. Everything exactly as she had described. He began to see others, and they began to ask. At first, the visits came like ripples, barely more than passing disturbances in the stillness of night. A flicker at the edge of his vision, a breath of cold air on the nape of his neck, a sense that something, someone, stood just behind him. Then the ripples grew. They took shape. They spoke. Some were familiar. There was Mr. Trevors, his 7th grade math teacher who had died of a heart attack in the middle of a grocery store aisle. He appeared in Daniel's kitchen, looking bewildered, holding a shopping basket full of canned peas. There was Ruth Fenwick, the neighbor who had baked him scones when he was a boy and who had died during the winter blackout 3 years ago. She stood in his garden, wringing her hands, asking after a cat no one had seen in decades. And there was Eric, a man Daniel had worked with briefly at a warehouse job 6 years prior. Daniel hadn't known him well, only that he died in a car accident on his way home. Eric showed up on Daniel's doorstep one night, face intact but with glass lodged deep in his jawline, asking him to call his mother. But most were strangers. A man with half his skull caved in sat at Daniel's kitchen table and asked for a pocket watch. A woman with no eyes, just empty folds of skin, stood in the hallway repeating the word basement. A boy, no more than 6, floated just above the ground, humming tunelessly as he followed Daniel from room to room. They did not linger. Each came with a need, a tether, something they had left undone or misplaced, an apology that had never been given, a secret that should have died with them. They were not angry, not malevolent, not at first. They were desperate. And in that desperation was something far more haunting than rage. They begged, they wept, they whispered his name like it was the last thing they remembered. "You're awake. You're always awake." He tried to ignore them. Locked doors, drawn curtains, eyes squeezed shut until stars danced beneath his eyelids. But they found their way in. They always did. No locks could keep them out. They moved through the walls like thought, appeared in rooms he had just left, spoke in voices that curled beneath the floorboards. They were not bound by space, only by the fact of his wakefulness, and they would not go until he listened. One night, a girl appeared at the foot of his bed. She was perhaps 8 years old, her dress torn and stained with mud, her bare feet leaving no mark on the floor. Her hair was matted, and her skin looked bruised, as if she had fallen a great distance. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, his voice fraying at the edges. She raised her chin, eyes wide. "My doll," she whispered. "I dropped it in the woods. It's lonely without me." He stared at her for a long time, hoping she might vanish if he simply refused to acknowledge her presence. But when he opened his eyes again, she remained, unmoved, unblinking. With a quiet sigh, he pulled on his coat and stepped into the night. The woods behind his house were hushed and breathless, the kind of quiet that settles over a place long abandoned. He walked until the trees began to close in, until the trail became nothing but patches of disturbed earth and moss. And then he found it. A small doll missing one arm, its porcelain face cracked clean through. He lifted it gently and turned back. She was waiting for him just beyond the tree line. She took the doll in her small, pale hands, smiled once, and was gone. After that, the visits intensified. The dead no longer waited for nightfall. They appeared as twilight bled into the day, and they began asking for things that left Daniel sick with dread. One asked him to dig up a grave. Another wanted him to burn a photograph, saying it held too much sorrow. A third, a teenager with a mouth full of blood, asked him to retrieve a knife hidden in an old barn off a county road Daniel hadn't traveled in years. Each request was stranger than the last. Each left him more exhausted. His days became a blur, indistinct and gray, his nights crowded with whispers and pleading eyes. He lost weight. His hands shook. He began to speak to people who weren't there, even when he wasn't sure they were ghosts. Mirrors no longer reflected his image quite as he remembered it. Sometimes his lips moved when he wasn't speaking. Sometimes his reflection didn't move at all. But worst of all was the feeling that something deeper lurked behind these visits. Something watching, waiting. The dead were drawn to him, yes. But so was something else, something patient, something hungry. The man appeared not with fanfare or malice, but with the quiet inevitability of dust settling on forgotten shelves. Daniel entered the living room one night, after a long walk meant to dispel the scent of mildew and rot that clung to his skin after yet another errand for the dead, and found him seated in the old recliner by the window. The lamplight painted no shadow beneath his shoes, though they rested on the hardwood floor. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, his hands folded neatly in his lap, and he gazed out the window with the relaxed posture of someone who had waited a long time and could afford to wait longer. Daniel hesitated on the threshold. Something about the man's presence disturbed the air in a way that was different from the others. He was not a ghost, or at least not entirely. The dead made themselves known through emotion, sorrow, regret, longing. This man radiated none of that. There was no hunger in his posture, no desperation in his expression. Only patience and an unnerving confidence that whatever would happen next, he had already accounted for it. "You've been helpful," the man said, his voice smooth and unaccented, as though it had been designed to be impossible to place. He did not turn around to speak. "But it's time for you to move on." Daniel's mouth was dry. He swallowed. "Move on." The man tilted his head, a subtle gesture, and finally turned to look at him. His face was precise in its symmetry, eyes evenly spaced, cheekbones gently sloped, mouth perfectly straight. But it was a face assembled, not born. The longer Daniel looked, the more he was certain of it. The features were too balanced, too inoffensive. A face constructed to comfort, or perhaps to disarm. It made him uneasy in a way that was deeper than fear. "You've served your purpose," the man said, rising to his feet with unsettling grace. "The bridge is open. The dead have passed, but the vigil must end. I didn't agree to any of this, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never asked to be part of whatever this is. The man took a step forward. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. No one is asked. Some doors are chosen, not built, and once opened they must be closed. You are not a victim, Mr. Cade. You are a mechanism. Daniel's heart pounded. He could feel the pressure behind his eyes building, the way it did when the ghosts became too many and too loud. But now, the room was silent. The silence of things holding their breath. The man's eyes darkened, not in color, but in depth. They became voids, swallowing light. You are the vigilant. You were never meant to last, only to last long enough. Daniel stepped backward, his spine pressing against the doorframe. Who are you? I am the Collector, he replied. And you are the bridge I've crossed too many times. The dead come to you because you never sleep. You were our beacon, but beacons burn out, and now it is your turn to cross. Before Daniel could speak, the room changed. The air thickened, congealed. From the corners of the house they began to gather. The dead, familiar and strange. The girl with the doll, the boy with the humming tune. Mr. Travers, Ruth Fenwick, the man with the missing skull. They did not speak. They simply watched. The Collector gestured toward them with a flick of his hand. You see, you served them well, and in doing so, you served me. No, Daniel said, his voice cracking. You fed off them. You used me to pull them out, and then you consumed what they had left. The Collector tilted his head again. You misunderstand. I do not consume. I preserve. Grief, memory, pain. They are finite, precious. I archive what others waste. I give the dead meaning beyond death. You made that possible. You're lying. I never lie. I don't need to. Something shifted in the crowd of ghosts. A stirring, a flicker of light behind their eyes. Daniel looked at them, not just as remnants of sorrow, but as witnesses, survivors, perhaps even allies. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the girl's doll, a torn photograph, the knife, items he had kept without knowing why. They remembered, he said. These things tethered them, not to you, but to who they were. The Collector's expression sharpened. You cannot unmake what is already written. I can refuse to keep writing. He opened the fireplace grate, one trembling hand placing the locket on the coals. The doll followed, then the photograph, then the knife. One by one, he placed the artifacts into the flame. As they burned, the air screamed, not with sound, but with pressure, a wave of fury and fear that rattled the walls and cracked the mirror above the mantel. The ghosts stirred. They stepped forward, not with malice, but with purpose. As each object was reduced to ash, the light in their eyes grew. They stood taller, less translucent. They turned toward the Collector. He stepped back. You don't understand what you're doing. Without me, they'll fade. There'll be nothing. Daniel, through clenched teeth, said, Better to fade as ourselves than to live as your collection. The dead surged, not in violence, but in unity. They passed through the Collector like wind through brittle leaves. He staggered, his perfect face cracked, and then, with a final breath of dark air, he dissolved, folded inward, gone. Daniel collapsed. The room exhaled, light returned, and the ghosts, no longer bound, one by one, turned toward the door and walked through it into something brighter. And then, they too were gone. When Daniel awoke, the morning light was soft and gold, filtered through the curtains in delicate threads that painted his walls with warmth. The silence in the house was different, no longer oppressive or heavy, but calm, almost reverent. He remained in bed for a long while, his body reluctant to move, not out of fear or exhaustion, but because something unfamiliar settled over him. Peace. He had slept, not drifted or dozed or hallucinated in the haze of sleeplessness, but truly, profoundly slept. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, in the quiet of his thoughts. The ceaseless buzz that had haunted his mind for 7 years was gone. The air no longer pressed against him like a weight. The walls no longer murmured. There were no eyes in the corners, no figures shifting at the edge of sight. The house was still, and in that stillness was freedom. He rose slowly, moving through his home like a man rediscovering the dimensions of the world. The floors creaked under his feet with a familiarity that now felt welcoming. He brewed coffee and stood at the window, watching the neighborhood stir to life. A paperboy tossed a folded bundle onto the pavement. A woman walked her dog past his gate. Life unfolded with the quiet rhythm of the living, unaware of the liminal threshold Daniel had stood upon for so long. Days passed, then a week. No more visitors, no whispers in the night, no knockless entries or flickers of pale light in the hallway. The house became a house again. He stopped avoiding mirrors. He began speaking aloud, not to the dead, but to himself, testing the sound of his own voice. Sometimes he dreamt, not of ghosts or shadows or fire, but of water, of open fields, of music he hadn't heard since childhood. The dreams came without urgency. They stayed a while and left him rested. He welcomed them. And yet, on rare nights when the air shifted and the world turned in its sleep, Daniel would wake and feel that old silence, the deep, watchful kind, not threatening, just present. He would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the dark, and think of those who had passed through him, not as hauntings, but as lives, stories, moments too full of feeling to go quietly. Once, just once, he thought he saw the little girl with the doll. She stood across the street beneath the halo of a street lamp, her hands at her sides, her expression serene. She did not wave. She did not speak. She simply nodded, turned, and disappeared into the mist. Daniel smiled. He did not know what came next, but he knew at last he was free to find out, or so he thought.
The fire dims, but the echoes remain. If you've enjoyed this tale, let the darkness know. Like, subscribe, and step deeper into the unknown. Until next time, keep the fire burning, because in the silence the stories are always waiting.